Somehow, we've convinced ourselves that this is my life, this is my body, these are my feelings, these are my friends, this is my hair, these are my arms, these are my feet, etc., etc. Somehow we've convinced ourselves. Of course, logically, and so-called common sense will tell us, well, you have plenty of evidence to indicate why this should be termed as your body, your thoughts, your feelings, etc. Meanwhile, since birth, all kinds of conditions and circumstances present themselves in a way to challenge that belief, that notion, that conviction that this is my life. These are my feelings. These are my thoughts, my perceptions, my memories, my consciousness. We have, of course, the aggregates, the component parts that make up a person, that the Dhamma explains to us as to the makeup of an individual. In Pali, they're called khandas. We've covered them several times. However, it's a very, very important teaching that Lord Buddha gave us, and it requires revisiting as often as possible during the day, and every minute if we can, when we can, because they help demonstrate the truth of this is not my body, in fact. These are not my feelings. These are not my perceptions. Which requires us to come back and look at this pronoun, I, this possessiveness of mine. In other words, this sense of personalizing or self-identification. These are my hairs. These are my eyes. This is my mouth. These are my teeth. Of course, when we get to hear the Dhamma quite a number of times, or when we read about the aggregates, eventually we become immune to that, in a sense that we develop these calluses or so what attitude. I get it, I understand it, big deal, let's move on. What's the next other juicier thing? Something that I don't know. When I mention to people how the Dhamma is supposed to be simple, despite the fact that it has so many different layerings, so many teachings within it, people don't seem to like that very much, the simplicity of things. Perhaps that's a mindset that we as a species have come to, perhaps, gotten used to. But that doesn't change the fact of old age, of sickness, of death, of destruction, and of fading away into oblivion. All of which cause us to become terrified. Fortunately, when logic is working against us to keep us in delusion, these are here to help us be awake and have a wakeful attitude, shake us into cognizing what it is that is really taking place. Is this really my body? There is this separation constantly. The jig is up every time you get a headache, let alone when a body part suddenly stops functioning. I know of someone several years ago. He called me and he was panicking. And I decided to go see him. And I realized what the situation was. The cause for his panic was the fact that he could not hear in one of his ears. I forgot which one, but ever since discovering the fact that he could not hear, he suddenly, one day he wakes up and he cannot hear in one ear. Now, the ears had been functioning beautifully throughout his life, over 60, 65 years of his life. Suddenly, lights were out. He went everywhere, every specialist you can imagine. He went, and every time he came back, he would become more gloomy in his disposition as far as the possibility of regaining his ear, his hearing. But what happened there? The person can continue on hoping that it will be regained, whatever that perception or whatever that sensation was, the door, the sense organ in this case. But what about if someone loses a limb? Neurologists, neuroscientists say that there will be phantom limb, the sensation that the limb is still there. I know in my case, when I lost my toes, I was mentioning this the other day to someone. I was only 8, but the doctors came and told my parents that, he will have a difficulty walking even with crutches, and let alone walking normally like everyone else. And then with my very limited understanding of the Arabic language at the time, I was only 8, they jokingly, I can't say jokingly actually, because they were trying to console me in a sense as a child. And they said something to the effect of, well, don't worry, the toes will grow back. I carried that thought with me for years, believing that the toes would grow back, until when I was about 12 or 13, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, they can't grow back. It's not possible. But that's what we like to think about this body. We go ahead and change the way it looks if we don't like it. And when we get sick, we do our best to get, better, of course. We have to. But there is that subtle desire to have things go back to, quote unquote, normal. because there's this comfort, this sense of comfort, this sense of safety in knowing that I have the sense of normalcy. But there can never be a sense of normalcy if we look at the five aggregates and see them for what they are, in the presence of the three characteristics of existence that are undeniably there, meaning impermanence or non-constancy, instability. How can I create a stability in an unstable environment with things that are by nature designed to be unstable? And then, because of us latching on to this effort, constant efforting, in fact, of trying to create this sense of permanency in an impermanent setting, that inevitably causes us to have dukkha, which is the second characteristic of existence. Dukkha, which Lord Buddha described as the sense of dissatisfaction, the sense of constantly feeling something's missing. Suffering, never feeling fulfilled, never being satisfied, leaving a hole in our heart. And that sense of anguish. And then the third characteristic of existence hits home with the five aggregates, because it tells us that there is no substantial thing there, that sense of that beingness of a self, of a oneness, of an identity, which Lord Buddha called it anatta, non-substantiality. So what do we do with all this? Are we defeated? Is that it? We show up on this stage of life and we're just like, okay, we have all these things working against us. That's one way of looking at it, but that's not the Buddhist way of looking at it, the way I understand it, the Dhamma. But we need to be realists to begin with. We can't start with a delusion and expect us to get to what Lord Buddha talked about as experienced as Nibbāna, freedom from that prison. But how do we do it? We can use it as our raft. We can use it to understand the three characteristics of existence instead of being on the receiving end of it, having the victim mentality of, okay, these things are happening, I'm trapped in it, so I just have to go through this. That's quite a pessimistic attitude to keep up, to keep in one's life. There's a verse in the Sutta Nipata, I was reading it recently. Let me see if I memorize it well. Saddha tarati ogham appamadena annavang viriyena dukkhamaccheti panyaya parisujjati. What the verse is saying, the first line, Saddha tarati ogham. Saddha is faith, trust. Tarati is to traverse, to go over. Ogham is the flood, the flooding. There's different kinds of floods in the Dhamma, described in the Dhamma. But typically what the flooding that is referred to is the flooding of passions, desires, the sense of possessiveness. This is my body. These are my feelings. You just hurt my feelings. You know that? And then there's this flooding. Even today, neuroscientists and biologists talk about the flooding of the amygdala or the executive prefrontal cortex when we cannot think straight. Flooding, ogha. So overcoming, traversing the flood with the help of saddha, or faith, is crucial. Every time we walk, we're trusting that even when we're looking, we're still trusting that the ground would hold. If you're walking on a porch, on a deck, if you're walking on grass or anything, we're expecting the ground to be there greeting us, saying, okay, go ahead, land on me, I'm okay, you're fine. There's an element of trust. We never think about where the next breath is going to come from. After we exhale, hey, there it is. We don't question it. But in order for us to overcome the flood of passions, we need to constantly anchor ourselves, at least in the sense of the faith. The faith of what? It could be any of the things that are described in the Dhamma, in the teachings. But it could also be directly extracted from your own experiences. Let's say how you used to relate to situations in the past versus now, thanks to your improved understanding of the Dhamma, shall we say, or your practice. When you have tasted some level of calm in your practice, tranquility, trusting that that will still work, not just while you're sitting, but in the midst of, let's say, a passionate argument or an uncomfortable state of mind while you're in traffic, perhaps, or when something happens, you spill the water on important pieces of, on important papers, for example. Trying to bring that mindset there. This is when Dhamma becomes applicable. And if Dhamma is not applicable, it's not Dhamma, the way I see it. It must be applicable. And this plays along beautifully with the simplicity of the Dhamma that I was mentioning earlier. And the next line in the verse says, Appamadena annavang, with heedfulness crossing over the sea of delusion. The sea of distractibility. Basically anything that puts us in this automatic pilot mode, where we start thinking, where we start taking for granted, falling back into old ways of thinking and processing, viewing this body as my body, and completely removing myself from the factual experience of old age, sickness, death, destruction, and fading away. So many of us, if not all of us, have to really, really struggle with this idea of death. I mean, conceptually, we understand it. However, when it comes to viscerally knowing it, that my bones will be crushed, that my bones will be, let's say, cremated. My body will be cremated. Some of us will put these steel walls to protect us even from the thoughts, the visuals. Some might not even like it when I'm describing it. That means you just have to work a little bit harder, because there's too much of an identification in accepting that this is my body, the belief that this is my body, the delusion that this is my body. You had world leaders, conquerors, all these characters in history, artists and things, making up their statues, plaques with their names on them. Cities, entire cities or countries named after them. Oh, so and so is Alexander the Great. You know, I want you to remember me. I was the conqueror of the world. Julius Caesar, this, that. And today, you know, politicians and billionaires wanting to go to different planets or out of the earth, hopefully with a one-way ticket, wanting to be remembered, because the idea of being faded away into oblivion is, for so many, even worse than death. Even if they've accepted the idea of, okay, fine, I know no one survives death, fine, but I want to be remembered for forever. What a deluded way of thinking. But so many of us, with all our degrees and experiences in life, we seem to really be challenged with relinquishing such attachments, such beliefs, such delusional ways of thinking. Because life is telling us another story, totally different than this, what we've come to believe. And the next line of the verse says, Viryena dukkhamaccheti. Through effort, through energy, energized perseverance, if you will. Dukkhamaccheti means going over, traversing over suffering. Difficulties in life, or stress, however you want to call it, but suffering, that anguish. Every bit of the work that we do in the Dhamma requires energy. There's not a part of the Dhamma that doesn't require energy. Some level of energy. Even the application of wisdom requires a little bit of energy. Even when you are deep in meditation, it's still requiring some energy. Fine-tuning it requires energy. Asking questions, whether you are still on the path, requires energy. Whether one is understanding the Dhamma correctly, meaning application of investigation, Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of the different Dhammas or states of mind, requires energy. Staying on your object of meditation requires tremendous energy. But somehow we forget. Going against the belief, the self-identification of this is my body. These are my feelings. You don't understand. These are my feelings, my concept, my perceptions. To remove ourselves from that requires energy. And it's not a one-time thing. We need to do it again and again and again until it becomes more of a habitual tendency, a positive habitual tendency, which is called kusala, kusala kamma, wholesome action. And then the last line of the verse says, Panyaya parijjati, I think it was. Parijjati. Basically, in English is um, panyaya means with wisdom. With the help of wisdom, one purifies oneself. This path is about wisdom and understanding. It's applicable wisdom. It's not about just gaining knowledge, adding more information. That doesn't help you when you are in the middle, in the crosshairs of difficulties. When you are in the flood, who cares about that knowledge that we have possessed? I mentioned this story that I've read somewhere years ago of this young man whose parents save up their, they give him all their life savings and send him off to a distant land to go and study so that he could become, and in those days they didn't even have proper school, so he goes to like university in those days. This is apparently happening a few hundred years ago. And 15 or 20 years later, now this adult man, this very well educated with several degrees, heads back home. And as he's coming back, he reaches the last leg of his journey where he needs to cross this sea, wide river, shall we say. And he hires this old man who has a boat to carry him across. And as the man is rowing and he is sitting surrounded by all his texts and manuscripts and things, his degrees, he looks at the old man and he says, "Old man, do you know anything about astronomy?" The man says, "No, my son, I don't." He says, there goes 25% of your life. A few minutes later, he asks, "Old man, do you know anything about mathematics?" And the man says, "I'm sorry, I don't know what that is." And he says, there goes another 25% of your life. And he says, "Do you know anything about rhetoric or logic?" And the man says, I don't even know how to spell those. What are that? He says, there goes another 25% of your life. Meanwhile, the water is getting a little bit more tumultuous because the thunderstorm is coming and the waves get rougher and rougher. And now the boat is all over the place. And the old man turns to this man, this younger, educated person, and he says, "My son, do you know how to swim?" And he says, "No, old man, I don't know." And he says, "There goes your entire life. 100%. Not in increments, 100%. So what we learn needs to be applicable 100%. That's why we practice. That's why we practice, because this is our headquarters, sitting down to meditate, practicing, stilling the mind, reading the suttas, trying to understand, after all, also leads to awakening. So many of Lord Buddha's students, to this day, have tasted Nibbāna simply by listening, simply by reading the suttas. It's that powerful. Well, so is sitting and then repeating those statements that moved us, carrying it with us every step of the way, literally every step of the way, allows us to eradicate the old ways of thinking that this is My life is so unique, basically. I'm an exception, okay? No. The Dhamma says no. We all have to fall into, facing these characteristics of existence. But even the concept of you're not special is like, it's so bitter for so many of us. When you look at the whole grand scheme of things, yeah. So there is that requirement for understanding to be there throughout our practice, which allows us to remove ourselves from this delusion that this is my body. These are my feelings. They're sacrosanct. They cannot be touched. Old age, sickness, death, destruction of this body, fading away even of our name, our presence that was, now it's no more, come to tell us otherwise. Which brings us to the experiencing of the Dhamma in a much more visceral, real sense, real way, and gives us a sense of lightness and joy, because we're no longer shackled by these concepts. And that's where safety takes place, in the middle of anicca, dukkha, anatta. So I will stop here, and hopefully you'll have some questions.
Bhante?
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. You said something relating to probably, well, I won't mention the celebrity's name, but about like, this need to be remembered, or yeah, I can't remember the exact words you were using. It's a bit futile, really, and a bit stupid, because I don't think it even, when you're actually on your deathbed, you'll realize that doesn't matter. And it reminded me of, there's a guided meditation that I think, well, no, we did discuss at one point by Ajahn Brahmali, the death contemplation, and he says about just imagining that you're on your deathbed, and at what one phase is imagining what the parts of you that make up your personality, like letting go of them, and that really brings up some interesting reflections in your mind, like what would I actually be remembered for? Not that that's important, or like what have I got to let go of? But I just thought maybe you could share something, like, for whenever we do eventually face that, like, what would you say is the best way to let go? Because it can be quite a pull, in the same way that letting go of family members or even possessions can be, surprisingly. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. It's one of the most powerful meditations in the tradition. Marananusati, which is the contemplation of death. And yes, there are, to this day, in Thailand and other Buddhist countries, monks have a special field trip that sometimes they do, where they go to the morgue, and people working at the morgues would know, okay, why they're there. So they pull out this corpse and they look at the body of this someone. And in charnel grounds where they still practice, in some countries, they still, obviously, in Nepal, in India, in Thailand, I don't know if in Thailand, if they still do it openly. I know bhikkhus, Buddhists, we do get cremated, but I don't know if it's like open, like the way it is in India and Nepal. Anyhow, seeing a body that's being, charred, burned, and turned into ash is quite jolting for so many of us. But still, it is someone else's body. I remember when I was a child, I saw a movie, and it's from Charles Dickens, The Christmas Carol, and Ebenezer Scrooge in the story ends up, being taken by this ghost to go and see the world without him. My heart sank when I saw those scenes because I put myself there. I was seeing like, oh my. He's going around and he's walking into this, I don't know if it was a mausoleum or crematorium, something like that, where his brother is standing all by himself and there's this casket. And the ghost says, go ahead, open it up. And he opens it up and it's his, I think he is even afraid of opening it up or something. And then there's a scene where he goes and he has to look down and see the tombstone and it has his name on it. That scene is very shocking. I mean, just to play it in our head. There is an intervention that I give sometimes to some people, not everyone, because not everyone can handle such a thing for some reason. And that is sending them to go to a cemetery during the day and walking around. In the Western countries, you're nicely surrounded by, grass and lawn. So it's many places, many cemeteries are done nicely. Even the tombstones are interesting. I remember when I was in the UK, we went together to a place, and it was it was beautiful in a sense. But at the same time, you're looking and some of the names had already been wiped out because of the rain, weathering, maybe acid rain, who knows, but the names had just flowed along with the raindrops. The inscriptions were wiped out. Perhaps their whole family line had been wiped out from that village. Now, pondering that possibility while the person is still alive, I think that is a very useful way of approaching and understanding the impermanency of life and how well we hold on. Well, when I say well, I mean like how stringent, how tightly we hold on to these things, whether it's this body or specifically in case of aggregates, let's say the feelings, the feeling part of my personality. But to give you something a little bit more tangible, perhaps would be something like this. Let's say you have an argument with someone. Someone is driving you off the wall. Someone is really getting under your skin, or you're finding yourself losing your balance to the point where you think, if this person did not exist, I think all of us would be a lot better today. For example, that's how intense of an emotion, like we were talking about the flood. There you go. Now, take the image of that person who's alive, maybe with veins, arteries bulging, angry at you, this and that. And in your mind, look down and see a tombstone. And it's their name. They're right underneath you, 6 feet under. They're buried. They've been dead, in fact. And then quickly fall back into, okay, that mindset where you're feeling, looking at the feeling itself. What happens to that feeling at that instant? When we think that this is the end of the world, like this is it, we're going to go head to head, this is it. Now, of course, when we have strong attachments to some people, individuals in our lives, significant individuals, and we don't even want to think of them getting sick, let alone dying. it would also help to kind of break that attachment to them by visualizing. Now, this is again something that a lot of people are not going to be comfortable with, and I understand that, because we still have this fear as a population, as humanity, I think. Not just it's a Western thing. No, you see it all over the planet, where we don't even want to see our loved ones dead. Well, why not? Why can't a person prepare oneself? Before my mother died, my dad died, I shockingly, it was not a joyride for me, but I started to do it in small doses in my mind, visualizing how would I deal with my mother being gone. Let's say I walk into her room and she's not there. So you can start from a safer distance instead of just jumping throwing yourself into the actual scene of a cemetery, etc. How's this working for you, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, it was for obvious reasons. Contemplating it about my daughter, that was exceptionally powerful. So yeah, I think what I was just thinking then is I probably need to journal about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really amazing. Thank you. A different take on what I was originally asking, but obviously amazing. So thank you.
But if I'm sorry if I veered from your question, but if please, if there's a way that I can come
No,
by.
sorry, no. I didn't actually even mean different from what I was asking. It was different from what I was expecting, I guess, is what I mean there. So please, I did not. Oh, sorry about that, but thank you. It was amazing.
What I'm also reminded of is one time when Ajahn Mahabua was alive, and he was relating his experience of Nibbāna as an arahant, which is quite a remarkable thing. You don't come across those in our contemporaries, and it's on, even you can even watch it on YouTube. And he gets teary-eyed. He starts crying, explaining that moment. But then, being an arahant, he also had, well, in addition to understanding and seeing and experiencing the fact that the person has now destroyed the asavas, the contaminants, they also do have two other knowledges that occur. In fact, they occur before. One of them is seeing one's own past lives. And the second knowledge is seeing where individuals are being reborn, where they're headed, basically, and where they're coming from, etc. Basically, but usually it's like where they're headed. And I can't forget, his tears become more, flowing profusely when he starts talking about to the people, the laity, the devoted laity who were there around him, how, and how he's holding back his words still, but even though, Ajahn Mahabua was known to being so passionate in his description, in his teaching methodology of the Dhamma, to shock people. But he comes to that point where he describes his own body, his own skeleton, if you will. And he gives this scenario. He says, look around you, he says. This country of Thailand, he says, because he was in Thailand and he was Thai and he was talking to the Thai people in Thai. And he says, if I counted the amount of times I had come back and died, just my skeleton, my bones would fill up the entirety of Thailand. The entirety, complete country would be flooded with his bones. Now, I don't know if your house is maybe, or your room is maybe 10 square meters, Imagine if it was full of your bones. That could be like in the hundreds of lifetimes. Just one room. 3, 4 rooms, 300-400 lifetimes. A neighborhood, a few million. So you see where this is going. Now, when we approach this, I think everyone should practice at least a few times in their meditation career, if you will, meditative career, because it's very powerful, it's poignant, and I am not of the mindset to say that this is only reserved for bhikkhus or bhikkhunis or monastics. It's not. Anybody who's eager to understand and to detach from our infatuated, this submerged, sticky attachment to our bodies and our aggregates, I think we need to be jolted. And especially when it comes to people that we care about. And no, being a parent doesn't give you a free license to go ahead and be attached, even though our culture gives you the permission to. In fact, there's given, people give you accolades or by titles and things. Well, where does that fall in all the grand scheme of things when there is old age, sickness, death, destruction, and fading away? I recently recorded suttas from the Anguttara Nikaya, and as I was working, in the translation, I was like, so many of the suttas in that set of 10, the Buddha is referring to these principles: old age, sickness, death, destruction, and fading away. And there's different scenarios. One time it's with in the Kosala Sutta, where he is speaking with King Pasenadi, who had come to visit Lord Buddha, but she was apparently sick. But it doesn't say, the suttas, commentaries don't say anything, but what happens is while he's sitting there, he just arrives and he's sitting there and he's about to listen to Lord Buddha, and one of his court attendants, he comes and whispers to his ear and says, Maharaja, Queen Mallika died. And guess what? Queen Mallika, he was crazy over her. He loved her so much. And he just almost loses it. He just slumps and it just is defeated. And Lord Buddha sees how he's feeling and he gives him a discourse on the 5 things that are impossible to obtain. In the Dhamma, when you come across impossible, and the Lord Buddha is saying, is like, wait a minute, you have my attention. Let's see what this is all about. Impossible to obtain. And then you see what he is talking about. Old age, sickness, death, destruction. When you're, as a king, you're anointing yourself with oils and special perfumes, and people are coming and making sure there's no white hair. If there is, you're pulling it out. Making sure the teeth are good, everything is good, you have enough. And then you have the image of your body being completely destroyed. And he says, Lord Buddha says, the uneducated, unlearned, common, ordinary person, in Pali it's putujjana, he says, does not reflect that, hey, old age happens to everyone. Sickness happens to everyone. Death happens. Putujjana doesn't think like that. He thinks, again, it's me. I am being singled out. Why is my hair falling? Why do I have this severe migraine again? Look at my friend. She doesn't have it. He doesn't have it. See? When my grandmother died, she used to live with us. When she died, I looked around and as a child, I'm looking around at the neighbors and they have their relatives, they have their grandmother. And I said, that's so unfair. I lost my grandma, but they still have theirs. A Putujana thinks like that. And because of that, there's more suffering, there's more dukkha, perpetuation of dukkha. When you go to an elderly, like a nursing home, I recommend everyone does that in their lifetime a few times, just to get to see the human condition in a more fuller sense. And you'll see different expressions. Sometimes you'll see just beautiful, brilliant smiles. And sometimes you see jealousy. Sometimes you see resentment in people's faces, in their eyes. I was like you, young. How come I can't get outside from here and just walk out? Oh, I can't walk. And if I go outside, where am I going to go to? I don't have a family. You do. You're going to your... See what happens? The person is resenting old age, feeling rejected by society, when they were a perfectly functioning member of society in the past. So the same goes with death. The same goes with destruction. Let's say you held a position, a very important position in the company, and then someone else comes over and takes over the position, or you retire. And you walk in and you see you go to the board meetings and you see how they don't even know you. I'm crushed. That's another form of destruction, or fading away, even worse. So these are things that are very valuable teachers. And so we have several examples where the Lord Buddha goes in detail, pointing out how, despite the fact that these are impossible to obtain, things that are impossible to obtain, that's not a cause for us to become, lose heart in a sense. In fact, it propels a person in their practice even more, because there's a deeper understanding that, oh, so you're saying that I shouldn't be identified with this body. So it was a delusion, this relationship, even. Ultimately, yes. Ultimately, yes. It's a path of wisdom, after all. It's about waking up. That's what Nibbāna is. To wake up. Not to add some more stuff. So thank you for your question. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Observing the sense of whether it's eyesight, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, thinking. Those are the ones that give us the quickest access to applying these, because they're happening all the time. Seeing is happening all the time. Hearing is happening all the time. So that is like the shortcut, the quick way to tap into the Dhamma. Even when we think that we're far away, the mind is so tumultuous, it's so much in a chaos, there's no way. But the senses are always bringing in information. Okay? What can I do with them? Check your attitude towards one. Am I leaning into one of them? Let's say the eyesight. Oh, look at that. It's a beautiful sight. Or, that rooster never stops. Or I could just say, okay, there's the ear. If it's functioning, okay, it's functioning so far. And then there's the source of the sound, the rooster. Okay, it's a sound that's being made. And then because of these two, there is this interaction, which we call sense awareness taking place. In Pali, we call it vijnana. Because of these three being there, suddenly there's this thing called phassa, or contact. Do you see there's still no like disgust so far? There isn't the disgust factor or the loving factor. It's just a sight. These are the eyes. There's the sight. And because they're meeting, there's the contact. And then happens the feeling. Feeling comes into view. When feeling comes into view, it's still not sullied. It's still not tainted with any identification. Now, can we stop there? Can we pause there? Can we just observe the whole living sense, perception, experience? Can we see it within those parentheses and stop there? If we do, guess what? You're on your way to becoming an arahant very quickly, if not already. But what we do is we lean into the feeling a little bit too much. And that's where we go ahead and bring in memories of the past and identifying it with a certain sensation, certain way, certain, and guess what? Like last week's sutta we were exploring, we resuscitate the past. Or we want to extend it further into the future by adding expectation to it or anxiety to it. Now we're involved. Now our hands are dirty in a way. So we've taken the sensory perception or perceptions out of context, beyond their scope. So if we can just use those parentheses of experience instead of being led into another story, away from the direct experiencing, then we would be practicing the Dhamma through and through. But we'll cover more next week during the Madhupindika Sutta, which is a brilliant, unique sutta that touches on this on so many levels. So we'll explore that. Any thoughts, comments, questions, critiques before we close today? Okay, so let's share some merits. May suffering ones be suffering free and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power share in these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May you be protected, your loved ones be protected, but above all, may you protect your mind and what goes in and what comes out of it. May you be safe, and may the Triple Gem bless you all. See you next week.